Carlos Hurd, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, woke suddenly at 5:40 a.m. on April 15, 1912, to the sound of noises in the corridor and silence from the RMS Carpathia's engines. He listened for a moment, and at all of the commotion in the hallway, he jumped from his bunk and shook his wife, Katherine, awake. "Something's going on. Let's go on deck and see what's happening." As Katherine dressed, Carlos walked out into the hallway. He ran into his stewardess. She pointed at a wailing woman and said, "She's from the Titanic. She's at the bottom of the ocean." Carlos, a reporter, immediately thought, "Oh my God." He ran back into his room, grabbed a pad of paper and a pencil. He told Katherine, "The Titanic has gone down and we are taking on our passengers." And then he disappeared again. Katherine ran to the porthole and looked outside to see a field of ice. To her, it seemed to go for hundreds of miles into the distance. When she gazed below to the sea, she saw 2 overturned lifeboats. After dressing, she rushed onto the deck. Carpathia passengers were crowded at the railing, watching the survivors as they came aboard. They were distraught with grief, exhausted, frozen. They'd been floating on the ocean for 4 hours. Spray from waves meant that most were drenched. Their clothes were frozen to their bodies. And it was only after they got on board that the real loss hit them. After searching the decks for loved ones that they hoped had been picked up by another boat and not finding them, that reality really started to set in for these poor people. Carlos wasn't the only newsman aboard. On the first day, he had run into 55-year-old Colin Campbell Cooper, an illustrator for the New York Tribune. Carlos sought him out and said, "We've got to document this. Will you help me? Will you question some passengers and I'll question others and we can compile a story together?" And to his shock, Cooper said, "Absolutely not. I'm on vacation. I'm not working." I get wanting to be on vacation, but this was a very odd decision. This story would make Carlos Hurd's career, and people would talk about it for the rest of his life. It's astonishing to me that any journalist would turn their back on this story. So Carlos did the only thing he knew to do. He went to his wife, Katherine, and he said, "Honey, I need help with this. We've got to talk to these people. I'll talk to some, and then you talk to others, and you come back and you tell me what they say." And at first she was scared. I don't want to do that. I don't know how to do that. I'm not a reporter. I'm not trained for this. These people have been through this horror. I don't know how to talk to them about this. And he said, "You can do this. They're segregating the men and the women. I won't be allowed to talk to the women, but you will. Just go and comfort them and get whatever of their story you can and come back to me and we'll meet and you can tell me what they've said." And begrudgingly, she agreed. Carlos wrote later of Katherine's help, "My wife was my only active helper in a task which 10 newspaper men could not perform completely." And the grief and the horror that she would experience through these women would haunt her for the rest of her life. This is Madame Morbid. I am your guide on any number of historical adventures. And today, I'm going to tell you about the Titanic man, Carlos Hurd, for years after 1912. And getting this scoop of a lifetime, Carlos Hurd, despite the fact that he felt he had stories later on in his life that were reported better, would endure person after person after person coming to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and asking to talk to the Titanic man. It was, for better or worse, the story of his career. And much of what we know about Titanic comes from Carlos's work. He was on site talking to these people and gathering their stories within hours of the event happening. From a historical standpoint, that is extremely important because the closer you are to an event, the more accurate the story you're getting from the witness. In researching Carlos's story, I went to the grave of him and Katherine. I went to the Missouri Historical Society's archives and viewed his collection. I held in my hands the notes he took while speaking to these survivors. I held an actual piece of Titanic stationery. Let's go back to the beginning and discover how Carlos found himself on Carpathia in the first place. Carlos was about 36 years old when this happened. He had been born in 1876 or 1877, I've seen both, in Iowa. He studied journalism right here in Springfield, where I am from, at Drury University, and was hired by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch right after he graduated. Katherine was actually his second wife. His first wife died in 1906. And he and Katherine had only been married for a few years, although they already had a family. They had 2 children who were staying with family while they were on this trip. Carlos had worked for the Post-Dispatch for about 12 years, and he had been given a leave of absence to spend a couple of months in Europe. In early April, he and Katherine went to Union Station and got on the train headed for New York City. While there, Carlos wanted to visit the New York World. It was a sister newspaper to the Post-Dispatch. The morning before they got on board Carpathia, he got up early and went by himself to the World building. It sounds like it was just a beautiful, ornate building with a golden dome that sadly no longer stands. But this building was equipped with world-class printing equipment, and Carlos just wanted to see it, and he wanted to meet the editor of the World, a man named Charles Chapin. Mr. Chapin only had a few minutes to speak with him, but he met with him long enough to find out who he was, that he was headed for a Mediterranean vacation in Europe, and that he was going aboard RMS Carpathia. While this may sound like a boring detail, it's going to be really important to our story. The fact that these 2 men met. And the next morning, Carlos and Katherine got on board the Cunard Line RMS Carpathia and thought nothing of it. It was April 11th. Their journey would seem extremely normal. They were having a good time. I'm going to read a little bit to you here from a letter Katherine wrote on April 13th back to her family that talks a little bit about what their voyage had been like the last few days. She described their day. At 7:30 a.m., a gong sounds for us. The maid comes and knocks at the door to tell us good morning. Then at 8, breakfast is served, and everybody goes on deck immediately afterwards as a duty. We walk, sit down, get up, and walk again, and play shuffleboard, and try to toss rings over a spike, and then suddenly there is a great commotion. People scramble around and shout to one another in great excitement. Man overboard? Land sighted? Ship sprung a leak? No, gentle reader, calm yourself. It is only the steward appearing with herb tea. This is at 11 o'clock, and it seems another half day before dinner is served at 1. The afternoon is much like the morning, and one day like another. Our accommodations are all that could be desired. Though we have some fault finding, I'm not crazy about the food, but expected to put up with some inconveniences, such as condensed milk, butter not of the first quality, etc. But say what you like of the eats, no one can complain of the sleeps. The night of Sunday, April 14th, when they went to bed, neither had any idea of all the drama that occurred that night while they were sleeping. The Carpathia received the message at 12:35 a.m. Harold Cottam, a 21-year-old wireless operator, was getting ready to take off his headphones and go to bed. But just before he did, he managed to hear the message Titanic was sending. CQD, come at once. We have struck a berg. It is a CQD, old man. Cottam did not waste a moment. He immediately called to a sailor and took the message to the officer of the watch, which happened to be Horace Dean. Dean read it, realized how important it was, and he and Cottam went together to the captain's cabin. Cottam didn't wait for First Officer Dean. He opened the door to the captain's cabin, completely ignoring protocol. He hadn't quite fallen asleep, but he was aggravated that they had just walked in without knocking. Cottam said, "The Titanic has sent out a distress call. She needs our assistance immediately." Captain Rostron turned to Officer Dean and said, "Mr. Dean, turn this ship around. I'll work out the course for you in a moment. Now, Cottam, are you sure it's the Titanic, and are you sure she needs our assistance?" Cottam said, "Yes, sir." Rostron replied, "All right. Tell them that we will be coming along as fast as we can." He then went to the chart room and began to plot the ship's position and the course they would take to reach Titanic. Titanic was notified that Carpathia had changed course and was making full speed. They were 58 miles away and would arrive around 4 a.m. He woke up stokers so that the ones that would be working would be fresh, and he put on as much speed as possible. The temperature on board Carpathia would have plummeted because all steam was shut off to other parts of the ship except for the engines. He got it up to 16 knots when its maximum speed was 14.5. Then he ordered everybody else to begin preparing for survivors. They were to maintain strictest silence and discipline. He put a steward in every gangway to reassure passengers that if they heard noise or inquired about what was going on, they were to be asked politely but firmly to return to and remain in their own cabins. Just as day was breaking, Carpathia arrived at the site. Captain Rostron said once they stopped and they saw how much ice they had sped through and how dangerous that journey to the site had been, Captain Rostron said, quote, "Some other hand than mine was on the helm that night." You could see the tiny boats on the horizon. One of them had a green light because one of the stewards had had the forethought to bring some fluorescent green flares with him. And a lot of the boats had used that green light to stay together. Margaret Brown said this part of the rescue was the longest part of the night. You could see a Carpathia and they were rowing towards it, but it was like they would never get there. And as the night wore on, the sea had gotten rougher and rougher, and they were getting wet. And it was so cold that a lot of the survivors, when they would get to Carpathia and it came time to climb this ladder, their hands were so cold they didn't function. And a lot of the women had to be put in this sling and pulled up on board. It took about 4 hours to pick everybody up out of the water, going back and forth, looking for all of these little boats. And eventually, all they were finding was wreckage and bodies floating in their life vests. Carpathia could not accommodate all of the boats, so about 4 of them were left floating in the sea. The population of the Carpathia doubled with the addition of Titanic's passengers. Carpathia had about 740 passengers, 325 crew, and 705 Titanic passengers were added. That's a lot of people to find a place to put. People who didn't have clothes in some cases. They didn't have toiletries. They needed toothbrushes, soap, combs. Luckily, there was enough of that in the ship's store to accommodate everybody. After Titanic's survivors were taken on board, Carlos said that was the last night men slept in a bed on board Carpathia. Female passengers of Carpathia were sharing their staterooms with female survivors of Titanic. The men would sleep in deck chairs or on the floor, the couches in the smoking rooms. 5 men who died of exposure were buried at sea. In a ceremony Captain Rostron oversaw, with passengers of Carpathia and the rescued from Titanic attending the funeral of these individuals. The decision was made to scrap going to their original destination, and Carpathia was now on its way back to New York City. Carlos would have 4 days to collect full accounts of what happened and write his story. Carlos gathered his stories. He was a really good listener, for one thing. And he brought the stories out of people willing to talk to him by just question and answer. And from his notes and from his story, it's clear that he definitely spoke with Harold Bride. Harold Bride was the junior wireless operator of Titanic. He had spent the night balancing on an overturned lifeboat with about 30 other men and had very badly frostbitten feet. Despite his injuries, though, he spent those 4 days helping Harold Cottam send information to people's families to let them know they were alive. He certainly must have spoken with Charles Lightoller. Charles Lightoller was the second officer of Titanic. He was also on the upturned boat, and he was the highest ranking officer to survive the sinking. The fact that he survived is absolutely amazing. He definitely talked to Robert Hitchens. Hitchens was a quartermaster. He was on the bridge at the time of the collision, and he is known for fighting with Margaret Brown in Lifeboat 6. And a survivor from St. Louis also really helped Carlos. His name was Spencer V. Silverthorne. He was a buyer for Nugent's department store in St. Louis, and he was sharing cabin E24 with another department store buyer, Edward Calderhead. Silverthorne was in the smoking room at the time of the collision. He was reading a book called The Virginian by Owen Wister when he felt the collision. He wasn't sure what they had hit. He thought maybe a whale or perhaps another ship. So he went out on deck and says that he saw the iceberg float by, leaving behind chunks of ice in the well deck. He warned everyone in the smoking room, but no one seemed to think anything of it. Then went to his stateroom and warned his roommate and the two gentlemen next door, and they knocked on the door of the lady across the hall, which likely seems was Margaret Brown. Their stories match up. Then all of them got into Lifeboat 5 and survived the sinking. He seems to have had a lot of guilt about surviving, and throughout his life is known to have made up stories about ending up in the water and being picked up by a boat after getting wet. This was not true. Being that they were both from St. Louis, Silverthorne really got together with Carlos and helped him. One of the things Silverthorne had done was taken a list of first-class passengers off of the ship. And in this way, Carlos was able to figure out who is here and who is not. In New York, editor Charles Chapin was at work laying out the Evening World's edition for April 15th. When he received the message from the Carpathia that they were picking up survivors from Titanic, Chapin suddenly remembered the man he had met several days before, and he thought, we've got a reporter on the Carpathia. I've got to contact him. So he prepared a wireless message telling Hurd, prepare a story on this, and then I will meet you at the ship with a tugboat off Sandy Hook. Well, Carlos would never get this message. Captain Rostron does something that I find a bit puzzling. I understand not wanting survivors to be bothered, but in addition to encouraging the crew to keep Hurd from talking to survivors, he also instituted a complete news blackout. There would be no news reaching the mainland of anything. Who had been saved, numbers of people killed in the disaster, number of survivors. News outlets were literally guessing, and you can see that in the headlines from that period. People were taking a gamble. Titanic sinks, everybody saved. Or Titanic sinks, 2,000 people lost. They were literally guessing, but they put the stories out anyway. I would think that would just be more painful for the families waiting for news. But he went around. He had workers go and confiscate anything that Carlos or Katherine could use to take notes. And he said the ship's store couldn't sell paper. I don't know if they meant specifically to Carlos or they couldn't sell paper to anybody. One of the things Carlos had to do was beg other passengers for paper. Do you have any paper? Can I please have it? They ended up having to take notes on anything they could find, including napkins, toilet paper. No matter what stood in his way, Carlos managed to make do. Rostron also had unannounced searches of the Hurd's stateroom. Well, they found ways around this as well. In the Edwardian period, you don't touch a woman. You don't search her. You don't ask her to move. So they started hiding the notes on Katherine. She would hide them inside her outfit, in her bodice, sometimes even in her underwear, whatever it took. If they happened to be in the room when they were searched or they had word that they were coming, they would gather everything up, they would sit it on a chair, and Katherine would sit on it. And that's how they protected the information. Most of the notes he took don't survive. There's only one sheet of notes. It's on very poor quality paper. It's like a brown newsprint, which is extremely poor quality paper, highly acidic. It was written in pencil, and it is clearly just an outline of the important notes he wanted to include in his story. In some parts, it's extremely hard to read because the pencil has faded so badly and because he crammed so many words into this one sheet. He was writing in the teeny tiniest little handwriting, and it's just hard to read. Carlos wrote his story in various corners of Carpathia. He would go in the dining room. He would puddle in a corner in the library. Anywhere he could get that was quiet, where he could sit down and work on his story. He wrote it longhand. It ended up being about 5,000 words long. Carlos and Katherine are wondering, how in the world are we going to get this story to the New York world? Spencer Silverthorne to the rescue. Carlos took his story, he bundled it up into a package about the size of an unabridged dictionary. Silverthorne took this and created a buoy out of a cigar box. They scrounged all over the ship, gathering up as many champagne corks or wine corks as they could find to put inside the cigar box. They tied the copy around the buoy with a rope so it would float should it land in the ocean. On Thursday morning, Charles Chapin chartered a tugboat to meet the Carpathia when it arrived in harbor. His plan was that Hurd would toss the story to him from the deck of Carpathia. And again, Rostron tried to keep information about when they were arriving away from the public to try to fool reporters, but it really didn't work. They all just stayed there and waited until they arrived. It was a nasty day when Carpathia finally pulled into New York. It was foggy, it was rainy, it was lightning. As soon as Chapin saw them coming, they jumped on the dazzle line and followed the pilot boat out to Carpathia. So here's how it worked. When a ship approaches New York Harbor, they are met offshore by a pilot boat, which brings the ship's pilot to whatever vessel is coming into the harbor. Because Carpathia was carrying all of these famous survivors, this pilot boat was absolutely surrounded by a mass of little boats full of news reporters who wanted to get on the ship as it slowed down to pick up the pilot to start interviewing people. Well, Rostron doesn't want this to happen. You are not getting on my ship. And he also doesn't want Carlos to get his story off the ship either. These people have megaphones and they are screaming at survivors on board Carpathia, "Tell us your story! What was it like?" Anything they could get, any news. This is also a time where when you took a photo, there was this massive flare if they had to use a flash for their photographs. So there were these magnesium flares going off as they were taking pictures. So Captain Rostron said to all the crew, absolutely no reporters are to be allowed onto this vessel. Also, that guy right there, Carlos Hurd, don't allow him to get anything off this ship. There was one guy who did manage to get on board. He jumped while they were stopped for their quarantine inspection, and he landed on the deck, but officers seized him, hauled him into the bridge to see Captain Rostron, who said, "You're not interviewing anybody. When everybody's off this ship, fair game, but you're not talking to anybody while they are still on board my ship." So it sounds like Carpathia arrived in the dark. So in addition to all this confusion and everything going on, they can't really see. The Dazzle Line has a really skilled pilot, so he is darting in and out around all of these rivals who don't have quite as good of a captain steering them, and they get right up beside Carpathia to the point that they actually make contact. And they start screaming, "Hurd! Hurd! Over here! We're from the world! Throw it over here!" Though it was hard to hear because we have the sound of not only Carpathia's engines, but all of these tugboats. But somehow Carlos manages to hear it and see where it's coming from. So they threw it but it caught on a rope. Even though sailors of Carpathia had been told not to allow anything off the ship, it doesn't seem everybody agreed about this complete blackout. So one of Carpathia's sailors climbed out, released it from the rope it got caught on, and dropped it into the Dazzle line, where Chapin took it and immediately got it back to get that story out. Carlos's story appears everywhere. Papers all over the world carry Carlos's story that he wrote on board Carpathia. His story was the most accurate. He was the first journalist to talk to anybody. His work was so vitally important. Carlos's story opens with numbers. How many survived? How many were lost? Broken down by class and crew. He discusses the problems we all are familiar with. There weren't enough boats for everybody. That the crew knew this. That even the boats that were lowered, because of sticking strictly to women and children first, often went down not full. The most interesting thing to me is that his story clearly says Titanic broke in two. That was debated for decades until the question was finally put to rest in 1985 when the wreck was discovered and found in two pieces. But clearly, Carlos talked to enough survivors who reported this happening that he included it in his story as fact. He talks about the reluctance of passengers to get in the boats at first. Nothing seemed wrong. He also tells dramatic stories of families parting, leaving fathers, sons, brothers on board while the rest of the family got in the boats. And he tells a pretty dramatic version of the sinking. Then I'm going to read you just a little portion here. Simultaneously on the upper decks of the ship, the ropes creaked of the lowering of boats. As they reached the water, those in the boats saw what those on the decks could not see, that the Titanic was listing rapidly to starboard, and that her stern was rising at a portentous angle. A rush of steerage men toward the boats was checked by officers with revolvers in hand. Some of the boats, crowded too full to give rowers a change, drifted for a time. None had provisions or water. There was lack of covering from the icy air, and the only lights were to still undimmed arcs and incandescence of the settling ship, save for one of the first boats. There, a steward that explained to one of the passengers that he had been shipwrecked twice before appeared carrying 3 oranges and a green light. That green light, many of the survivors say, was to the shipwrecked hundreds as the pillar of fire by night. As the end of the Titanic became manifestly but a matter of moments, the oarsmen pulled their boats away, and the chilling waters began to echo, splash after splash, as passengers and sailors and life preservers leapt over and started swimming away to escape the expected suction. Only the hardest of constitutions could endure for many minutes such a numbing bath. The first vigorous strokes gave to heartbreaking cries of "Help! Help!" and stiffened forms were seen floating, the faces relaxed in death. Revolver shots were heard in the ship's last moments. The first report spread among the boats was that Captain Smith had ended his life with a bullet. Then it was said that a mate had shot a steward who tried to push his way upon a boat against orders. None of these tales has been verified, and many of the crew say the captain, without a preserver, leapt in at the last and went down, refusing a cook's offered aid. In the Marconi Tower, almost to the last, the loud click of the sending instrument was heard over the waters. Who was receiving the message, those in the boats did not know, and they would least of all have supposed that a Mediterranean-bound ship in the distant South Atlantic track would be their rescuer. As the screams in the water multiplied, another sound is heard, strong and clear at first, then fainter in the distance. It was the melody of the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," played by the string orchestra in the dining saloon. Some of those on the water started to sing the words, but grew silent as they realized that for the men who played, the music was a sacrament soon to be consummated by death. The serene strains of the hymn and the frantic cries of the dying blended in a symphony of sorrow. Led by the green light, under the light of the stars, the boats drew away, and the bow, then the quarter, the stacks, and at last the stern of the marvel ship of a few days before, passed beneath the waters. The great force of the ship's sinking was unaided by any violence of the elements, and the suction, not so great as had been feared, rocked but mildly the group of boats, now a quarter of a mile distant from it. 16 boats were in the forlorn procession, which entered on the terrible hours of rowing, drifting, and suspense. Women wept for lost husbands and sons. Sailors sobbed for the ship which had been their pride. Men choked back tears and sought to comfort the widowed. They strove, though none too sure themselves, to convince the women of the certainty that a rescue ship would appear. Early dawn brought no ship, but not long after 5 a.m. the Carpathia, far out of her path and making 18 knots instead of her wonted 15, showed her single red and black smokestack upon the horizon. In the joy of that moment, the heaviest griefs were forgotten. Carlos then tells the story of him waking up and he saw the last of the boats being unloaded. And he said that he saw women, some with cheap shawls about their heads, some with the costliest of fur cloaks, ascending the ship's side. And such hope as the first sight of our ship may have given them had disappeared from their faces, and there were tears and sighs of faltering as the women were helped up the ladders or hoisted aboard in swings. Disheveled women who the night before could have drawn thousands from their husbands' letters of credit or from the Titanic safe stood penniless before the Carpathia's purser, asking that messages be forwarded, collect. In the middle of the morning, the Carpathia passed near the spot where the Titanic went down. Only a few floating chairs marked the place. The ice peaks had changed their position. Which of these in sight, if any, caused the wreck was a matter of conjecture. Carlos's claim to fame remained his work on the Titanic disaster. He personally received a $1,000 bonus from Ralph Pulitzer for getting this scoop of the century. Having returned to New York and gotten survivors where they needed to go, the Carpathia got all the passengers back on board, and though a few days late, left for their originally scheduled trip. Katherine said in a letter there was a part of her that wondered, should we continue with this vacation? After all the suffering and the broken families and the pain she had just witnessed from these devastated people, she just wondered to herself, can we continue with this fun? And ultimately they decided to continue, and so did all the other passengers. Only 2 people chose not to continue with the voyage and to just stay in New York, and they gained 1 additional person. So essentially the passenger list was basically the same. They had their vacation. The Pope even arranged to have a meeting with Carlos when they were in Rome. Not as a story, not as a scoop, just wanted to meet this famous journalist who had just reported on this legendary news story. He was 73 years old when he died. Unfortunately, Katherine died quite young. She died in the 30s when she was 49 years old. She had a heart attack. You're not going to believe what happened to Charles Chapin. The editor of the New York World in 1918 basically had a nervous breakdown. They had no money. They were desperate. He had a history of anxiety and depression, and he had decided to kill himself. He did not think his wife, Beatrice, could make it without him. So he wrote a note, he shot her as she slept, and then he lost the nerve to kill himself. He ended up in Sing Sing prison, where he was a model prisoner. He took it upon himself to build a beautiful garden where he became known as the Flower Man of Sing Sing. That's in a story of itself. Margaret Brown, I know I keep bringing her up, but she's very entwined in this story. You all know her as Molly Brown, by the way, but that is a name created for the musical in the 1950s. She raised money for the crew of the Carpathia and for their heroism, and she presented Captain Rostron with a loving cup and a medal in honor of his bravery and service in saving the lives of all of these people. Rostron continued to command the Carpathia for another year. He then had the captaincy of various other vessels and even was captain of a vessel at the Battle of Gallipoli in 1918 during World War I, and he was knighted in 1926. as a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. And eventually he became Commodore of the Cunard Fleet. He retired to Holmcroft, West End, Southampton, and he died at age 71 in 1940. He was visiting his daughter when he took ill, contracted pneumonia, and then died there in the hospital in Chippenham. One of the greatest things I have ever had the opportunity to do was to meet his granddaughter. She was absolutely delightful to talk to, and I actually discussed Carlos Hurd and his efforts to silence him when I was talking with her. She was just the nicest lady. I met Margaret Brown's granddaughter at that same event, and I'm not saying I didn't enjoy talking to her, but Rostron's granddaughter really made an impression on me. Two of his granddaughters were there, but I only got to speak with one of them. So I have seen the loving cup that Margaret Brown presented to him. It was much smaller than I expected. That was back in, 2016, 2017, at the Titanic Museum here in Branson. RMS Carpathia was used as a troop transport during World War I. She herself sank when torpedoed by a U-boat in 1918. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button, subscribe. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/madamorbid, or you can send a message, thoughts, ideas, comments to madamorbidtopics@gmail.com. I will see you all next time.